Hello everyone, welcome to the Eternal Patch Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and the time has come to dance upon Sodi's Spellshaper's grave. We are into some new patch notes coming out 227.20, which is to say tomorrow, probably today for most people when this video comes up. I have made mock-ups of all of the new cards that are being changed and what's being changed. There are some buffs and a lot of nerfs, and it's going to be pretty interesting to talk about. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to be discussing all the different cards that have changed, sort of how we feel about them, and also what the general sort of design goal was with these. Basically, like the current Eternal setup says, or from the patch notes, we understand that like time is dominating Throne and Expedition in a lot of different places. Draft, diversity, and balance still seem to be well in the desirable range, and there's a lot of nasty Elysian decks out there, which is not a huge surprise. We're seeing even Elysian very frequently in Throne, and Elysian Flyers in Expedition, both of which probably need to be tuned down a little bit. To that extent, there's an obvious culprit, and it's Sodi's Spellshaper, which has finally been nerfed out of the even-handed golem range, and also out of the range of being quite as solid as it used to be. This card was always very cheap to play, very easy to use, and very obnoxious to deal with, so it's definitely welcome to see it go up to 3. We certainly would have been fine with the Spellcraft being 3 as well, but this takes it completely out of even-handed decks, which I think is a really, really big deal, because those decks really rely on that card draw to sort of infuse their deck with a continuous source of value. And Sodi's Spellshaper is one of those things that kind of like really needs to be dealt with in that particular respect. This is a really, really solid option. Even Elysian is like clearly the deck to be targeting here. And also, I just don't like this card. I've never really been very fond of it. The sort of bouncy castle House of Fun thing has never been particularly entertaining. And when attached to a unit that draws a card and is very difficult to deal with in its own right, it just ends up being a really obnoxious aggro tool. I'm not a big fan of this card, so I'm glad to see it nerfed, and yeah, this seems like a pretty awesome nerf in general. I've been saying that this card should go to 3, or that the Spellcraft should go to 3 for, I think, since Flame of Zolta was a month in, so this is a little bit late for me, but I think it's the right call for sure, and pretty excited to see it. All right, what's next? Next up, we have a nerf to Teacher of Humility. This has gone from... Oh, no, unfortunately not. One second. Okay, so not a 1-1, but this card has gone from a 3-3 to a 3-2. The answer for this one is pretty simple. Like, this is a development in response to Torch being nerfed. While, of course, Starwolf still likes Torch being nerfed, and like that is probably not a change that they're planning to roll back anytime soon. Teacher of Humility, in combination with Defiance being sort of nerfed out of the point where it's used quite as much, and Torch being nerfed out of the point where it's used quite as much, has really risen to prominence in both even Elysian decks and also in just a wide variety of time decks. It's a powerful card, the Infiltrate is really, really good, and the card trades well with most other units because it is, of course, remarkably overstated for a time unit. Early aggro is not necessarily a thing that time should do well, so I'm fully in favor of this change. This does allow it to be killed by Char and a number of other different options. It also means that it can be killed most commonly simply by trading with it with a 2-1 of some kind. I think this gets Teacher into a really reasonable trading position. Like, it's much more likely to die in a trade, like it probably should, as opposed to infiltrating consistently. This used to be a card that people conceded to basically whenever they got hit by it. I think people have finally learned to play around it quite a bit. It still hates on markets very hard, and there's still a lot of like interesting interactions with it. I'm perfectly fine with this card being playable and even being viable in the format. I think that the extra health off of it is certainly going to be a relief for a lot of different people who really did not like this card, and so yeah, all in favor of this one. This is a pretty solid option as far as things go, and yeah, it seems like a really good nerf to Even Elysian in particular. Also, it means that most of the Even Elysian decks are going to be having those cards run into other even-handed options. Magnificent Stranger seems like a lot better option now on 2, that is a card that wasn't nerfed this patch around, but might end up being more of a problem in the future based on like what we've seen so far. All right. Next up, we got Borderlands Lookout. This is not an even Elysian card, but it is an Elysian card that has always been rather strong. This is in the Throne section, but I actually think this card is actually a lot more dangerous in Expedition, where 3-color decks are really kind of fun and desired, and Borderlands Lookout just ends up being a 3-4 for 3 pretty frequently. The current nerf is from a 0-1 with +1/+1 for each type of influence to a 0-2 with +1/+0 for each type of influence that the enemy player has. So instead of being a 3-4, it'll be a 3-2 against 3-color decks. Instead of being a 2-3, it'll be a 2-2 against 2-color decks. Against 1-color decks, it's going to be a blank 1-2, which is not great, but also about the same stat that it had before against monocolored. This actually makes the card a lot less playable. It is much more likely to trade in with a number of different things. Still pretty viable if you're playing elf aggro in particular, because if you're in elf aggro, you're certainly not unhappy to have a 1-drop that has that aggressive of a stat line. But now people can interact with the card in a pretty serious way. It was another really staple part of like the Elysian aggro deck from last set that like just kind of bulldozed a lot of different types of decks and really basically made it very hard for a lot of decks to come into the meta. I think that this card was always kind of oppressive, and I'm very glad to see it nerfed. Along with Sodi's Spellshaper, this one's a little late for me, but I'm very glad to see it gone. It enables a lot of different strategies and should encourage a lot of variety in Expedition in particular. This nerf is apparently for Throne, or at least it's in the Throne section. I've never seen this card in Throne, but sure, I'm into it. Seems good. Okay, next up we are going to be looking at, well, Sodi's Spellshaper is also in the Expedition nerfs. We also have a nerf to Skywriter Vanguard. Okay, so this one's a little interesting. Skywriter Vanguard is going from a 3-cost 2-1 to a 5-cost 3-1 with the same spark ability flying. Your flying units get +1 strength. That's actually not as bad as it looks. Like, I would say that overall the stat line is certainly not good, but that spark ability is fine coming out later, and if you get that spark ability later in the game, it's probably going to be pretty devastating, maybe even game-winning at the time that it comes out. But now the card's very vulnerable. It doesn't provide a huge amount of stats on board in addition to its spark ability, which is very, very powerful. All of my experience with this card is primarily in Limited. I actually didn't see the Elysian Flyers deck that used Skywriter Vanguard, or if I did see the Skywriter Vanguard version of the deck, it almost never played Skywriter Vanguard. For some reason, like, we managed to get up into like top 50 in Expedition without ever seeing this card. Apparently it was very popular in Elysian Flyers, and that seems likely to me, because honestly the card as a 3-cost 2-1 was really, really good at buffing large boards of Flyers and making a lot of game states pretty untenable. In addition, it buffs up a number of key cards in the format for Elysian Flyers. So if you're going to hit Elysian Flyers, this doesn't seem like a bad place to start, but I also am not sure if those Flyers decks can't function without this card. So a bit of a curious one for me. I just didn't see the card, but like, to my knowledge, it is a very powerful flyer. I was surprised to learn that it was an Expedition in these patch notes, just because, yeah, I don't know, I guess I got lucky and I never saw it in a game against Elysian Flyers, of which I saw quite a lot. Nonetheless, seems like a pretty good choice as far as nerfing the Flyers deck goes. There are obviously other targets that can be hit as well, but this seems like a pretty interesting one, and we are going to see another target hit here, which is going to be Darren Griffin, another card that I wanted to see nerfed back in Flame of Zolta, and am now pretty happy to see nerfed as it stands. So Darren Griffin was a 3-2, and let me get the new version of the card. It is going down to a 3-1. So, same thing, Flying Exalted Reckless. When you play a spell, sacrifice to negate it. The main difference is that it now has 1 less health, which makes it a little easier to kill and trade with by flyer, and more importantly, a little easier to kill and trade with the flyer that it is buffing. So Darren Griffin still encourages the same play pattern, where basically your opponent is stuck playing one of their spells as a counter spell to Darren Griffin or as a removal spell to Darren Griffin, which automatically triggers the Exalted and gives them a unit that they have to kill that also has flying and reckless, both of which are sometimes disadvantages, but in general pretty advantageous to have. This card's got a really powerful and dominant cycle. I think that it's still a powerful card at this particular stat line, but I think the stat line brings it in line with a lot of other cards as far as like playable flyers go. You should still be running this in most of the places that you were running it. I don't think that the extra health loss is as bad of a deal, since it still gets to buff up the attack of a number of different flyers. And one of the things about flyers is that while they are very vulnerable in health stat lines, this card they are always pretty good at doing damage and tend to win the game by doing damage and ignoring interaction. Darren Griffin helps disable interaction. It helps buff the other flyer up to the point where you can deal a lot of damage, and it tends to do that in a way that's actually really difficult for other decks to deal with. So yeah, it's still a very playable card. The loss of health should make it a little easier to trade with or kill the card that Darren Griffin is on, which can lead to some ways to win games against Darren Griffin where Darren Griffin would previously shut the game out completely. But you still have to be on the ball to play against it, so I think that this is a solid nerf that isn't taking the card out of the meta in any respect. Edict of Grodov is getting nerfed. Another card that I'm a little surprised to see on the list, but I can sort of see it. Edict of Grodov has gone from 3 to 4. Essentially, they are saying that the chilling effect on large, expensive Primal and Shadow units was a little bit too much in Expedition. I didn't see a lot of this, but certainly it is a nasty card if you are playing it against certain types of decks. Obviously, like most of the Primal cards right now are cheap and aggressive flyers, so this might encourage people to go into some more expensive Primal stuff. And I do like expensive Primal stuff, and I like expensive anything, so I'm fine with this card being nerfed down a little bit. Notably, this card now puts the card in range of Transpose, which I think is just better for Elysian. Like, if you can Transpose and grab an Edict of Grodov, that's probably going to be a useful tool against a flyer. So in Expedition, this may actually be a net buff to the card, which was already very, very slow as a removal and tended to be a market pick in the first place. Now it seems like something that is very at home in a Transpose market, but you really can't main deck it, which if you were main decking it, that's a bit of a bummer because the nerf is doing exactly what it was intended. But if you were putting it in your market, I think this card is now actually like just a more viable market option. Combray can no longer run Edict of Grodov against a lot of Primal stuff due to the fact that it can't run it with the market card that gets 3 costs. So that's a little interesting, but overall, like, this seems like something that might enable big Primal decks to play around with it a little bit. It's just sort of moving it into a different slot. It's still an expensive card, and the ability to put something on the bottom of the owner's deck is not necessarily the most solid way to set things aright as far as things go. It's also not a great counterspell. I don't know if this is going to see a lot of play at 4. It's pretty difficult to play even at 3, so this seems like it might be something that really takes it completely out of the meta, which, if that's the intent, so be it. I think that there are other removal options in Time that are perfectly available and can actually do some pretty interesting stuff, and Time has never generally had access to hard removal in this format, so that seems like something that doesn't seem unreasonable. All right. Next up is Entrancer. Entrancer is another nerf to the Elysian Flyers deck. The Silence a unit has gone from cost 4 or less to cost 3 or less. So effectively, this card now silences less targets. It's much less likely to actually hit something. And if you're playing big expensive cards like Strangers, for example, or anything along those lines, then this card might not mess with people's strategies quite as much. It's a little bit safer to play those bigger cards. I've seen decks like Armory decks that are pretty comfortable playing nothing up to like 5, and there's a lot of cost 3 or less, cost 4 or less type stuff happening at the moment, so like lower cost cards are actually kind of disfavored in general. So this card doesn't seem like it's going to be a huge impact on the meta one way or the other, but it does seem like it's a less likely target for Elysian Flyers in particular. That particular deck might not want to run this anymore. It's a little bit inflexible, it's less likely to hit good targets, and like those targets that it does hit, it really might not do that much to. Like, a lot of the earlier drops are also the better statted ones that don't have as many relevant abilities. So yeah, this is probably taking a little bit out of Elysian Flyers. Seems unlikely to make as many decks, but you might want it for a particular matchup or a particular type of deck, and that seems about right for what Entrancer wants to do. All right, we come to the big ones. Grodos and Makar's Stranger are both being nerfed to stats. This is like, I was predicting this. In fact, I actually predicted the exact nerf, which is Grodos Stranger down from a 7/7 to a 6/6. We have a brew coming out tomorrow. it will be up like very shortly after this one, actually, and it has both Grodov's and Bakar's Strangers in it. I still think it's a pretty good brew, so hopefully it'll be good to go. It's actually a double feature because we have it in both Throne and Expedition, but we'll see how well those decks hold up with the new nerfs that are coming out at the same day that that brew is coming out. Alas, woe is me, this is what I get for queuing up videos for the entire week. Anyways, yeah, so 6/6, plays a Stranger, random sigil, when it attacks, shuffle a void, draw 2 cards. The main thing about this is that this card is now a little bit more capable of trading, and since this is a card that wants to attack the turn after it is played basically every time, this is a pretty significant nerf to the card. It will attack, you will probably trade it with something, and then you won't get the continuous benefits of the card just basically spiraling the game completely out of control for you. Or it can now be killed by Obliterate, it can be killed by certain killer units, it can be killed by a lot of other things that might eventually like sort of allow you to sort of get into a better position. It doesn't do as much damage, doesn't provide as much pressure, but it is still a very powerful card. I think it's still a very good card, and I think it's still a card that you want to play on top of your curve in both Throne and Expedition. It's just not going to make as big of a hit in your win rate now because the card will just not win the game for you the way that it previously did. Yeah, so you get the random sigil, which is still a big deal. Like, this card has onboard value that eventually extends into your later game, be it a late game Praxis build, or just a bunch of spells, a bunch of new strangers, or like playing strangers into strangers. All of that stuff still works. The attack ability still draws you cards, which allows you to refresh yourself as long as you are actually playing the card into other stuff. And it shuffles voids, which is also really relevant and very important in Throne, where Reanimator is very popular and other types of stuff is like kind of like, it's very important to sort of keep track of voids on occasion. This also pops Aegises, and it draws cards. All of that value still exists. The main thing is that now the card is just basically a good brawler instead of the best brawler. It will trade much more frequently. It will sometimes even make bad attacks into other cards that have 7 health or more, and like that's going to be something that actually does have a bit of a chilling effect on the card's win rate because it's no longer good from every possible angle. That being said, you still play this card in control shells for the like amazing amount of things that it does, and in general ramp, like it does all of the things that you want it to do, and those things are all really, really relevant while also still being a 6/6 for 6, which is certainly not unreasonable. Makar's Stranger has gone from a 5/3 to a 4/3. This one is like a pretty minimal nerf, I think. It does mean that Makar's Stranger is more likely to trade with, or trade poorly even, on an attack, because you might not be able to take out 2 units with 5 or more health. But in general, you're playing this card on 4 or 5 with some sort of like discount on it, perhaps. And once you play it down, you get to steal a card, so Makar's Stranger still immediately replaces itself. I think this is much less of a strong nerf than it was to Grodov's Stranger, and I think that's pretty fair. Like, this card is very, very aggressive and really interesting, but like overall, like the ability to just give it some vulnerability on attacking, since it really wants to attack to get that kill effect, means that you're going to be seeing it around a little bit less long, similar to how Grodov's Stranger works. Both of these cards just stick on the board like glue. They're really hard to get rid of, and like if you don't get rid of them, then like very bad things happen to you. With this one, if Makar's Stranger gets an attack, you might block it with another unit, and then you come out a little bit even, still not completely even, but the Makar's Stranger player is only a little bit ahead as opposed to a lot ahead. I think that's a big deal. Does make the card like a lot less playable in some aspects, but also like the fact that the card doesn't trade very well is not as big of an issue for a card that kills units when it attacks. So curious to see exactly how this one turns out, but I don't think it's that bad of a nerf. I think it is a justified nerf, certainly, because the card was insanely strong before and definitely had some pretty interesting hits coming to it. So yeah, that's a pretty interesting one. All right, that's the end of the nerfs. So finally we get into our buffs. Let's talk about them. We have Kodash's Armor first. We talked about this card a little bit in our previous decks, so this is going to be... let's check here real quick. I think I have the wrong spoiler. Yep, all right. So Kodash's Armor is going from a... It's got the same cost, and it has the same spellcraft cost. but the new ability is reduced from 5 to 4 to give a single faction unit +5/+5 this turn. I've actually tested pretty extensively with Kodash's armor. I think the card is pretty interesting. If you can get the Zolta Convoy out earlier, that's the thing that like really makes this card shine in terms of its overall ability to like sort of do a control matchup. But I think that giving it a cheaper option on the single faction units is actually really interesting in terms of increasing the overall tempo of this card, which is probably where the card is designed to be played. In our big like control deck, this is like a minimal effect, but it does mean that it costs 1 to do it with Shardbinder, and that you can do it more frequently with a large amount of power. You can use that +5/+5 ability multiple times at 12, up to 3 in fact, and you can use it quite a lot. Like, I would say that this actually is a huge buff to the card if you're using it in tandem with Grodov's Burden, and generally like making that sort of like Shardbinder type deck work. So if you want to go back and look to our Monoculars list, Eternal Brews, this is a good place to put it, and the card's buff is probably going to improve the win rate of that deck a little bit. I would say that this card is now quite a bit aggressive. That pay 4 ability is a little feast or famine in that it means that you aren't developing the board to give that +5/+5 bonus, but if you do give that +5/+5 bonus to anything, that card becomes a real beater, and it's very hard to deal with units that are attacking in with a +5/+5 bonus because you are basically unlocking any type of unit and making it into just a monster. Super cool buff. I think this should make the card a lot more playable, and like probably playable in decks other than the one that we were running. So I think that's pretty interesting, and yeah, could be end up being used in a lot of different places. The ability to summon a Zolta Convoy is still very useful in control, and like it seems much more aggressive now in the short run, which is always interesting. Makar's Quiver. The Spellcraft has gone down. I did not correctly do that. Spellcraft is now 1, so all right. We won't fix this one, but yeah, the Spellcraft on Warlocks Brew is now 1. So Warlocks Brew costs 1, which means that if you want to Makar's Quiver the Spellcraft, you can now give a -2/-2 to anything for 3. Pay 6 to give a single faction unit. Strength Equal Die is Strengthen Your Void. Still kind of an interesting and useful way to end out a game in, say, Felon Control, that type of thing. And the single faction unit ability is always beneficial, although not necessarily a requirement of the cards in terms of value. I would say that a 3-cost Warlocks Brew actually does not seem like that bad of a deal. I think Warlocks Brew costs 3 in the first place. I'd have to double check it, but yeah, like Warlocks Brew is nonetheless like a pretty decent card against a number of different setups. That just doesn't really get played because it's more of a draft card in Eternal. But yeah, the card normally costs 2. Costing 1 extra along with all of these extra stat lines means that you actually have a pretty decent option available here, and like I think that pay 6 ability is just very, very handy if you're trying to get a bunch of flyers over. I think Feln flyers makes a lot more sense with Makar's Quiver, and the ability to take out tokens and multiple units at a time and occasionally just get insane amounts of value out of the card for very, very cheap is really, really interesting. Overall, I think the card's very strong. I thought the card was kind of strong before, honestly, but I hadn't really gotten a chance to play with it, and I think everyone else kind of gave it a pass as well. So seeing a little bit of strength on this might actually put it into a broken state. We'll see exactly to what extent that ends up happening. Okay. And last but not least, well, maybe least, but an interesting nerf to a draft card that should improve its draft viability at the very least. Willbreaker has gone from a 1/1 to, let's find it, a 1/2. So a little bit of extra health on it. That means that the corrupted unit sticks around for a little bit longer, meaning that you're much more capable of playing those curses on enemy units with flying. And also, I believe the intent here was an expedition to make the card a little bit better against flyers. In general, though, this buffs a pretty important common in draft, and I think that's a big change to unseen in draft, because Willbreaker was always kind of a common that you were a little skeptical to run. The double damage on it is super handy, but that 1/1 stat line for 2 was always just barely capable of trading, and frequently meant that the curse flying ability just never came out. You would play it on 2, you wouldn't get any units with flying because there weren't any units with flying down, and then later on the unit would die to something and you wouldn't be able to activate the curse because the corruption costs 3, and it's just like a little bit hard to get that going if the card dies at the end of your turn or under some interesting circumstances where you've already played a unit. Now you have a little bit more time to activate the corrupted ability because the Shade is going to stick around for a whole other turn. And in addition, that stat line is now effectively a 2/2 for 2, which is the kind of stat line you want to see on a 2-cost unit. A 2/2 for 2 with double damage, or a 2/1 for 2, a 1/2 for 2 with double damage is actually a really well statted unit. You get to be like, if you buff this up in any way, the double damage becomes very, very scary. This now plays alongside Hero of the People really well. It is a skill that you can attach other skills to. Survivability really helps with all of the sort of extra battle skill stuff that's going on. I think this just makes the card a lot more playable in every format, but in particular, I think this is a really strong draft buff, and Justice now actually has what you would call a good common, as opposed to just a pile of really unusual ones. This is pretty interesting. Overall, should make the draft landscape a lot more interesting, and obviously, as an intended nerf to Elysian Flyers, this seems like a good choice to buff it up and take that Elysian Flyers deck down a little bit of a peg. Seems like a pretty savvy nerf, definitely makes a lot more hits to the Elysian Flyers deck, and with attacking it from so many angles, I expect to see a little bit less of that Flyers deck in the future. Overall, I didn't have a lot of problems with that deck. I think the stuff we were playing was just not too vulnerable to it, but now that we're seeing some nerfs to it, it is going to be much more reasonable to play a bunch of other stuff against it, and like in general, I am pretty sick of Elysian. I've been seeing it since playing with Zolta, so like this is something where I'm glad to see that deck getting nerfed down a little bit. It should be an interesting change and should hopefully open up a wide variety of new jank and new and exciting tier 1 decks. So thank you so much for watching. This is the end of this particular video, but we will be back with our Brew on Strangers tomorrow, and we should have some stuff for you on Friday as well. So thank you once again, and I'll see you all next time with more Eternal Brews, and of course, keeping up with all of the patch notes. You can find me on Twitch, YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter. That's pretty much it. Bye, everyone. Have a good one.